Lebanon's Saad Hariri announces a reform package after days of protests that have swept the country, pulling together all segments of society. Do stay tuned for a report from our team on the ground. Kurdish fighters withdraw from a Syrian border town besieged by Turkish forces. This is the first pullback under a 3-day-old US-brokered ceasefire. Deadly protests continue in Chile against the cost of living, the government extending a state of emergency and a nighttime curfew in the capital. Hello and a very warm welcome back to France 24. Those are our top stories this hour with me, Sanam Shantier, and the team. We start with Lebanon, where the country's prime minister has agreed to bring about reforms to ease an economic crisis that has sparked nationwide protests, the largest in 5 years. The proposed changes are expected to be approved in a cabinet meeting on Monday. Meanwhile, this Sunday, hundreds of thousands flooded major cities and towns, demanding an end to corruption and the rule of the political elite. Earlier, I spoke to our regional correspondent, Leila Maulana Alan, and I asked her what the reform package is likely to include.
What they're trying to tackle here, the problem that Saad Hariri is trying to tackle, is the incredible dive that Lebanon's economy has taken. And part of the reason for that is that historically, allies in Europe and North America have helped to bail Lebanon out when it's had economic problems. It's long had this dollar peg, which really is unrealistic, but has been able to support itself until a few weeks ago when things started to slide very badly. And there now is money on the table, but for the first time, these allies are saying, we are not going to bail you out unless you listen to us and make some changes so this doesn't keep happening. There is about $11 billion on the table that they could access, but there are a series of austerity measures that they spoke to their allies about last summer that they were supposed to be introducing. And that's one of the reasons why people in Lebanon are so angry, because they feel that they are constantly being pinched more and more to try and change the country while nothing is happening to the political elite. So one of the things that triggered these protests last week was the idea that there would be a new tax on WhatsApp communications, WhatsApp calls. Already telecommunications in this country, one of the most expensive across the Middle East, and that really sparked things off last Thursday night. So immediately Saad Hariri turned around and said, right, we're not going to have any of these new taxes. But then the question was, if you're not going to tax people and have more austerity measures on individuals, what are you going to do? So what he's come up with this package today, he asked on Friday for 72 hours to come back to the people. And what he's saying today, among other things, is he's going to have a 50% reduction on salaries for current officials and former officials. The fact that former officials are still paid salaries there should tell you something about how people feel about the political class in this country. They're also going to radically overhaul quickly the electricity system here, which is mired with problems, and there are blackouts throughout the day across Lebanon for people. They want to privatize telecommunications. And the other thing they want to do is they want to have a 3.3 billion investment in various banks, which they hope will bring them to a near zero deficit, they're saying, in 2020, which is a big ask. So these are the things that he's put forward as a suggestion. Tomorrow, the cabinet's going to vote on these, because he said he would get back to the people, so to speak, by tomorrow evening. And it does look like those packages will pass in the cabinet.
Our reporter Leila Maulana Alan there. Now, a look into what led to these protests. Lebanon is one of the most indebted countries in the world. For the first time in over a decade, the country is also running low on hard currency, specifically the US dollar. That has been driving petrol prices up, one of the reasons behind this opposition movement. Our reporter spent the day with a taxi driver from a Hezbollah stronghold to hear why he's decided to add his voice to the dissent.
We all want change. We've been promised a lot, but in the end, nothing. Lebanon is going backwards.
This is Hassan, 24, a cab driver and a supporter of Hassan Nasrallah. Today he's bringing us to Dahieh, a stronghold of Nasrallah's party, Hezbollah, and one of the poorest suburbs of Beirut.
In this area, lots of people are out of work. Many just get out of Lebanon to work abroad. That's become normal now.
Lebanon's economy is in dire straits after relying for years on foreign bailouts. Investors are now unwilling to cough up, meaning ATMs are running out of dollars and fuel prices are rising too. Hassan pays $150 a week just to keep his taxi running. The government has now declared an economic emergency and warned taxes may have to rise.
Ordinary people, us, the working classes, we are the one being hit by all of this. And our taxes are rising. But our politicians are ignoring the poor. We deserve better. We deserve a fairer tax system.
$11 billion in foreign aid has been pledged for Lebanon, but some of that money has been held up by Gulf nations who don't want to give money to a government that includes Hezbollah. The party doesn't support the protests, but many of its supporters, like Hassan, are nonetheless going out into the streets.
All of Lebanon is out in the street, Beirut, the north, the south, and I'm so happy and proud to see it.
In a country where sectarianism can feel omnipresent, Hassan and his friends today have decided to come out with just the Lebanese flag.
Moving on to another crisis in the region, the main Kurdish group in Syria has announced that it has evacuated the northern town of Ras Al Ain. The statement comes after stern warnings from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, saying he would crush the fighters if they did not withdraw. This is also part of an agreement reached between the US and Turkey. Also this Sunday, a rather vague message from Donald Trump, yet another one, who tweeted that US troops are pulling out of Syria and going into Iraq instead. Luke Schrago has more.
A column of ambulances and vehicles carrying Kurdish wounded pull out of Ras Al Ain. The northern Syrian town had been encircled by Turkish forces for days, with clashes flaring, as Ankara accused both the US, which brokered a days-old ceasefire, and the Kurds of playing for time.
Our expectation from our American allies are to stick with their promises this time. The time that Turkey lost due to the stalling tactics and Manbij is obvious. We do not want those kind of wrongdoings to be repeated again.
Turkey wants a 30-kilometre deep buffer zone along its southern border evacuated of Kurdish forces, so it can resettle millions of Syrian refugees from its own territory who'd fled the civil war. Under the ceasefire, the Kurds agreed to withdraw from an area 120 kilometres across, but Turkey wants a zone far larger, across Syria's northeast for over 440 kilometres all the way to the Iraqi border. This as US forces continue their pull-out from the region to head for western Iraq, all the while insisting they still want to work with the Kurds on anti-terror operations.
We both agreed on the importance of continuing the Defeat ISIS campaign. We're still in contact with the SDF on the ground as well, and they are still, as best we can determine and as best they report, defending the prisons that are in their area of control.
While the Kurds have until Tuesday evening to complete their withdrawal when the ceasefire expires, questions still remain over the fate of Islamic State group-linked detainees the Kurds have been holding at several camps, and just who might take over security if Kurdish forces have to leave.
Over to the Chilean capital, where at least 3 people died in supermarket arson attacks. This comes following 2 days of violent protests sparked by anger over economic conditions and social inequality. The movement has intensified since the state of emergency was declared across the South American country. As part of that, nearly 10,000 soldiers were deployed during the overnight curfew. Now, according to observers, scenes like this have not been seen in Chile since the Pinochet dictatorship. And I'd like to cross over to Andrea Chastain, a historian of modern Latin America. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. This is by no means an organized movement, is it? It's simply very ordinary Chileans who've had enough.
That's right. Yeah, these are spontaneous protests and uprisings that have happened over the last few days. It started with high school students protesting fare increases on the metro a couple of weeks ago, and has spiraled into much more widespread and very spontaneous movements.
You're saying it's spontaneous, but we're also seeing a great deal of looting, which people are saying is diverting the attention away from the actual issues that are bringing these younger generations of students to the streets.
Yes. I think that the vast majority of people are not in support of the violence. I think that there's a widespread of just a pervasive sense of anger and rage at the status quo, and that the majority of people are protesting peacefully. Of course, there have been many more incidents of violence than we've seen in a long time in Chile, but it expresses a widespread feeling of discontent with the political system. I also want to say that a lot of social movements and social groups are organizing. So the metro workers and the larger labor federation, students, and other kinds of grassroots social groups are pushing together, and they're actually calling for a general strike tomorrow. So it remains to be seen what's going to emerge out of this. I don't think it will simply remain this sort of spontaneous actions that we've seen. I think that something bigger will come out of it.
So the momentum continues in a way, and speaking to people in Santiago, there is a great deal of concern about the security personnel that have been deployed across the streets, the force they're using. It's all rather reminiscent of the Pinochet era, is it not?
Yes, yeah, it is. It's very alarming. It's very troubling for people to see military tanks deployed on the streets. This is the first state of emergency that has been declared as a result of protests since the Pinochet dictatorship. It has been declared previously as a result of earthquakes, but those were very different situations. And we're also still, alarming for people to see the military deployed on the streets. A lot of images and videos are coming out of police and military really brutally arresting and really brutally treating people on the streets, people who are just out to protest and to assemble. And with the state of emergency, people's right of assembly is being curtailed. People are being arrested and really mistreated in jail right now.
Absolutely. Last question for you, briefly, if you can, Andra Chastain. Can we expect to see an escalation here, or will this simply serve as a wake-up call to the country's leadership?
I think that this has the potential to become a much more widespread movement. We saw that in the early 2000s, 2006, 2011, with the student movement, which really galvanized people across society and pushed for real change. But I still think that the political elite is not listening to people's popular demands. But I think that there's enough widespread discontent that it could mobilize students, workers, women's groups, other kinds of grassroots groups to push for change. And I think that the recent abolition of the fare increase is only one very small step. And I think that currently the metro is one of the most expensive in Latin America, and it just sort of exemplifies Chile's rule of experts that are not listening to or incorporating popular demands into the way transit policies are being made. And so my hope is that they will actually listen to this and not just return to the status quo.
Andra Chastain there, calling this movement a push
eliminated.
for change. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on France 24. Now, it was election day in Bolivia, with millions casting their ballots amid a climate of uncertainty. The vote, which is now closed, comes as President Evo Morales seeks a controversial fourth term. This will determine if he extends his administration to 19 years. That's just under 2 decades. The move has fueled protests and charges of creeping totalitarianism, which he denies.
It's a potentially history-making election for Bolivia, as polls opened for 7.3 million eligible voters. On the ballot, President Evo Morales, hoping for an unprecedented fourth term in office. On Sunday, he urged his people to vote.
I call on all Bolivian people to participate by casting their votes for the well-being of our democracy.
Morales' candidacy has been mired in controversy. Corruption allegations have engulfed his tenure, and many voters are furious at his refusal to step down. His popularity has waned, but with 13 years and 3 terms in office behind him, he is the longest-serving president in Bolivia's history. Morales' third term has already defied term limits set out in the 2009 constitution, a law Morales drafted himself. In 2016, he then proposed a referendum to remove these limits. The public voted down the removal, but the government rejected the results. The Constitutional Court, stacked with Morales loyalists, then ruled it was his right to seek re-election. With this in mind, some voters are skeptical about the fairness of this year's presidential election.
I don't have trust in the elections because I think the electoral court is being manipulated by the government. So I think the elections are going to be fraudulent.
With his popularity at historic lows, polls suggest this vote will not be a categorical win for Morales. Currently polling in second place, his biggest competition is former President Carlos Mesa. If neither one wins an outright majority, they'll go to a runoff election on December 15th.
Well, that's it from us. Thank you for watching.